Welcome back to the Party House tier list. We're going to speed things up a little bit now because there's quite a lot of rankings left to do and not a lot of time. Though there is still one thing to quickly get out of the way before we jump back into it, and that is, while they aren't significant, I do want to do a teeny bit of reshuffling. My opinions were pretty solidified by the time I started making this video, but obviously I still have played more in the meantime while I've been making these videos, and there's a couple guests I want to shuffle just a little. I'm shifting the Rockstar down to the bottom of B, although he's still remaining in B tier. It's still a very valuable unit, but it's kind of similar to what I said about the Monkey. He's certainly a lot better than the Monkey because he makes money, but while from a pure perspective of being cheap for a lot of reward, the Rockstar is well worth it. From the perspective of being a moneymaker, you don't like a moneymaker that makes trouble, especially if it's only giving you 2 cash. And from the perspective of just being big value, you'd probably rather buy a more expensive troublemaker that gives you more value while still only taking up 1 trouble slot. This is of course by no means to say that the Rockstar is bad, especially if you've got a trouble management strategy, the Rockstar is very good. It's just that when I first started playing this game, I very much used trouble management strategies quite a lot, but the longer I played, especially in random scenarios, I found it's actually often quite wise to just not take any troublemakers and just take a teensy bit of trouble mitigation, because then if you ever get rid of 2 wild buddies, there's only 2 left in the deck, and then you just have free reign to do whatever you want without any risk of actually losing the day. And that is really powerful to have, and you can't have that if you take troublemakers. So just in general, the general strategy of taking troublemakers and trouble management has slowly devalued in my eyes the longer I've played. Though certainly, if you're just looking for big booms, not consistency, but just hype games, not gonna lie, still a really good strategy. As well as that, the hippie is moving down, not necessarily because I think it's bad, but more because I think the caterer should go above it. Again, the caterer is just a lot more consistent, and consistency really matters in this list. For the most part, this is just a reshuffling of B tier, however, there is one big shift, at least relatively speaking, that being I want to bump the driver up to high A tier. I very much understood the value of being able to take any guest you want from your deck using a driver. I just had some bad experiences where I just barely couldn't make enough popularity to get the things I needed in time because I was taking too many drivers. However, the longer I've played, the more I've realized that I was just unlucky with a lot of those runs with drivers, and most of the time when you take drivers, even when you take maybe a bit too many, it doesn't really tend to shoot you in the foot all too bad. Not to mention that there are so many synergies with an ability like this that it's almost impossible not to find some kind of synergy you can abuse with your driver, even if you don't have a synergy at the time you get it. For that reason, and again the increased importance of consistency, I think it's more than fair enough it should be bumped up to A. That covers the reshuffling of any things we've already put on the list. A couple things that I hadn't yet put on the list but planned to put in a certain position also moved a bit, but most of them not more than a single tier. There's only one, which I'll mention when I get to it, which did make quite a sizable jump. With all that said, let's get right back into it. First thing to kick off level 2 is the Private Eye, a variant of the Driver. It does the same thing, pulling any guest you like from your deck, but it's a little bit different. It costs 4 popularity instead of 3, but it gives 2 rather than giving nothing. However, the real kicker is that you have to pay the Private Eye 1 cash every single day he appears in the house. To be quite honest, when you first get this guy in level 2, because of the fact that the actual constructed levels give you lots of moneymakers and money isn't really an issue, he kind of is better than the normal driver. But again, we're mostly basing this ranking off of random scenarios, and for that reason, I would actually say it's probably worse than the normal driver. Again, you really don't like having to pay this guy, especially because you probably want multiple of them to increase the consistency of your deck, and that's also going to entail severely draining your cash gain and severely shrinking your house, which is going to have some pretty severe long-term consequences in the long run. That being said, the effect of the Private Eye is of course the exact same thing, and for the most part you're buying it for the same reasons in the same places. As much as it stings that you have to pay him and you don't have to pay the driver, there's also very few situations where you don't take a Private Eye where you would have taken a driver. So I think it's fair to say, while it goes below the driver, it still is an A tier guest. Next up is a rather polarizing guest, the Introvert, an interesting one to say the least. They only cost 4 popularity and they only give 1, but their special ability is interesting. Essentially, every empty slot in the house will give you 1 popularity if you have an Introvert in the deck. Now, at very first, when I just read what this thing did, I thought it sounded quite bad. Because, don't get me wrong, that could certainly help you in situations where it's not safe for you to let any more people into the house, but you don't want to lose loads of value. Obviously then having an Introvert makes it so those empty slots don't give nothing. But in terms of a pure value assessment, a 1 for 4 is obviously a bad deal, and ideally you should be filling the house. And if you are filling the house, then your introvert is just a bad deal. If you're not filling the house, then while it might seem like your introvert's a good deal now, you're losing so much theoretical value by not filling the house that it doesn't seem worth it. If the introvert was just a safety net for worst case scenarios, while that would provide consistency, that would still be pretty underwhelming. And so I thought the introvert seemed pretty bad. But obviously once you start playing with it, you quickly realize its power. Sure, being a safety net is nice, but that isn't the real kicker. The real big deal with the introvert is the fact that you can stack them. Sure, usually it's going to be worthwhile to keep letting people into the house even if you have an introvert if you have only one, because it would only be worth it if you expect the average value of the next thing to come through the door to be less than 1. Which, if that was true, your deck would be pretty pathetic and you'd probably have bigger problems than whether to open the door or not. Problems that the introvert probably couldn't really fix on his own. However, once you get 2 introverts in the house, now it actually becomes kind of enticing to just end the day early. Every empty slot is worth 2. If the average thing to come through that door is less than 2, it's worth it. 3, even 4. Obviously that's the high roll, but if you can get 4 introverts into the house and end the day early, you honestly get so much value that you're not really losing anything anymore by not letting more people into the house. With that being said, do I think the introvert is actually good though? It's alright. I'd put him like a low B. You're not mad to see an introvert usually. Again, it's a great safety net for your deck, and as long as you stack them, which you're probably planning to, they can give good value. That being said, you do need more house space to actually get huge value off of introverts, and that means you need money. But if you're letting less people into your house to proc your introvert synergy, that means that you're getting less money as well, which means you get less house. You can kind of see the problem here. Ultimately, the introvert just finds a way to always cancel out with itself until it's middling. Which sounds like a real indictment against it, but ultimately, being middling is usually good enough to reach the finish line and means you are very consistent, which is technically pretty good in our case. So it's just enough to reach B tier in my opinion. This is going to be a bit of an awkward one because I'm going to have to be quite vague on my reasons until later. But while it is the bottom pick for this tier, I do think that the Grillmaster is the next S tier pick for me. It is the worst guest in S tier in my opinion, but it still deserves S tier. And that might come as a shock. The Grillmaster's a fine guest. He gives 2 popularity, he only costs 5, and he has the ability to make everyone leave the house temporarily so that you can essentially re-roll yourself for that day and get a new house full of guests. The same guests that the Grillmaster made leave can re-enter the house, so this isn't like kicking people with security or booting people at the door. They can come back in. Again, it's essentially just a re-roll button. And don't get me wrong, this is already a good guest simply for being a well-priced, decently statted re-roll. But if it was just that, it would probably be a low A or high B. The real reason it cracks S tier is due to a single very, very important synergy that you need rerolls to execute, and this synergy is powerful enough that I cannot in good conscience put this guy any lower than S tier. However, we haven't discussed the main guest this synergy is built off of yet, so we're going to have to cross that bridge when we get to it. So you know how earlier I mentioned there is a single guest that synergizes with old friends? Well, here it is. The Mascot. This guy, I'm just going to get straight to the point, is going in E tier. So, needless to say, I do not approve of this synergy. The Mascot costs 5, has 1 popularity, and his ability is simple. For every old friend in the house, you get an extra +1 popularity. And that honestly might sound like a good deal. I mean, you start with 4 of these guys and you can't get rid of them anyway. Buying more of them is dirt cheap, you can get an extra 4 to make it 8, making it the only non-star guest in the game you're allowed to get 8 of, and then you're getting more value for each one? That sounds like a good deal. Or at least it might sound like it's good until you actually break out the magnifying glass and start looking at the numbers. You're paying 5 for a 1 that gives you +1 for getting 1s. To put that in perspective, the idea of this essentially is that you're turning things that are 1s into 2s, and you also have to take a terrible guess in its own right to make that even happen. And don't get me wrong, 2s are okay, but that's just it. It's just okay. And that's your payoff for taking an overpriced and underwhelming guest that also forces you to get more overpriced and underwhelming guests to actually have their synergy make sense. Now don't get me wrong, this also has a similar interaction to the Introvert, where while its effect is very underwhelming and often causes you to sacrifice more value than you gain for going for this synergy, They can pay off when you really stack the effect. Turning all your old friends into 2s instead of 1s for something that's this weak on its own is obviously a bad deal, but turning them into 5s? That's a great deal, even if you do have to get 4 mascots in the house. But here's the problem with that strategy. First of all, you are going to have to go all in, because of the fact that the bigger you make your deck, the harder it's going to be to find all your mascots and your old friends. And the less of them you find, the more and more your main synergy becomes absolute garbage. But then beyond that, not only is this synergy difficult to set up and very demanding of your deck, but also it only provides you popularity. It doesn't provide you money, it doesn't provide you tutoring, and it doesn't provide you any kind of trouble mitigation. So those are 3 things that just about every single deck will need at least some of, that this synergy gives you none of, while also getting worse the bigger you make your deck. You can probably start to see the problem now. If you simply decide you're going to live without having money, your house is going to be too tiny to actually fit all the old friends and mascots you're going to need to get value. If you decide not to get any trouble management, then you'll have to keep ending days early and keep accepting payouts of 1s and 2s. The only thing you could maybe get away without would of course be tutors, but then you're probably not getting 4 mascots in the house most days. You're probably only getting 2, maybe 3. For all these reasons, mascot synergy is essentially a massive burning trash fire. It is an enormous beginner trap that you should not really go for. I say this, but of course there is footage of mascot synergy working right now on the screen because, as I said, I forced myself to use and make work even the guests in the game I think are some of the worst. And I will say, this game is very well made. There are very few guests that just simply don't function. For the most part, everything has its purpose. But the stars had to align to make the run you're seeing on the screen work. You really need effective deck thinning tools to make this deck work, where you eliminate all the cards that you don't want from your deck as fast as possible, so that the chances of getting the cards you do want skyrocket as high as possible. But when it comes to this game, there are not a lot of deck thinning options at all. In fact, basically the only one is Cupid, a guest that we haven't gotten to yet because they're towards the end of the game. But you can see in this deck I'm using a lot of Cupids because they function both as trouble management and as deck thinning simultaneously. If I didn't get off of these Cupids, this deck would not function. For all those reasons, you might be amazed this guy's just not in F. But there is at least one saving grace of the mascot. That being that he is the single most safe and effective instant popularity boost pick. It's kind of like taking a monkey early, except you don't have to worry about a troublemaker bomb sitting in your deck for the rest of the game. Early on in the game, where your deck is comprised of practically nothing but old friends, having 1 mascot in your deck in the early game just to get an early popularity boost is a really safe and effective option. It will usually be giving 2 to 4 popularity every day, and on top of that, later in the game, it's going to give less and usually be a 1 or a 2, but that's about it. It's not the worst downside in the world to have a 1 or a 2 in your deck that doesn't help too much, for the upside of having a popularity boost at the start to get your money makers faster. Next up is the Gangster, a pretty simple guest. He causes trouble, but he gives you 4 cash. He's not popular at all though, he doesn't give you any. And initially this guest was a little difficult for me to rank because I used to think they were really good. The main reason being they cost 6 popularity, and 6 is a very consistent number of popularity you can expect to get on the first day. So you can usually afford this guy day 1. As well as that, he gives 4 cash at once, which is literally the most a single guest in the entire game can give at base. Especially early in the game, when expanding your house costs less, this is an enormous boost. And of course back then I was more fond of trouble management as a strategy. But as time has gone on, I'm starting to think that the Gangster is not quite as good as I thought, but still a decent guest, at B tier, just above the Rockstar. The Gangster is insanely good early. Getting a turn 1 Gangster is really, really nice. But Gangsters as a long-term money-making strategy kind of are painful to work with. Not only because they are troublemakers and they are going to cause your deck to explode a whole bunch, but even the fact they give no popularity is a little bit of an issue. Usually popularity cost is not a big concern in this game, but in fairness, often you do need to spend popularity to get guests to help mitigate trouble, and if you're getting the trouble first, like you often are with the Gangster, that means that you aren't going to get enough popularity, most likely, to even afford the things that you need to use to mitigate the risk the Gangster introduces, at least not quickly. You might think the answer to that is simply get the trouble mitigation first, then get the Gangster. and that doesn't not work, but you gotta remember then that if you're doing that, you're making yourself take longer to set up your house, and that's the whole reason that the Gangster's supposed to be good, is that if you get one early, you can expand your house super fast and massively high roll. So yeah, nothing wrong with the Gangster. It's certainly a viable source of money, especially because it's so ludicrously powerful early game. Like, turn 1 Gangster is S tier, but like past turn 1, it's kind of underwhelming as a moneymaker because of all the risk introduced from using it. Next up is the cute dog. It's literally the same as the hippie, it prevents 1 trouble, but instead of having 1 popularity it has 2, but that means it costs 7 popularity to buy rather than 4. Now in terms of pure ratio, while a 1 to 4 and a 2 to 7, you know, the 2 to 7 is a little better, generally, if I was talking pure stats, I would say that this usually would look a little bit worse, taking the cute dog. But I'm not gonna lie, in general, when it comes to the later game, you're really worried about things that give 1 or less popularity taking up house slots. Whereas 2 seems to be this sweet spot where you kinda don't care if something is clogging up house spots as long as it's giving 2 or more. The hippie and the cute dog, as you'd expect, both have their situations. When you need to rush trouble mitigation as fast as possible because you're having to deal with things like gangsters, hippies are better. But in general, against most troublemakers, when you're just taking your time and you just want to set up the most solid long game trouble mitigation strategy, Cute Dog is definitely the better pick. It's a little bit tough to pick one over the other, but I think Cute Dog is a little bit better than the hippie. It goes in B tier. Next up is the Gambler. Another guest I'm kind of surprised debuts in the same level as another guest that's very similar, because the Gambler is almost identical to the Gangster. It just costs 1 more popularity to buy at 7, and has a 2-3 stat line rather than just giving 4 cash. But yes, they cause trouble. And initially, because of the fact that these 2 guests debuted in the same level, I didn't think much of the Gambler, especially because I could also compare it to the Rockstar, which was also cheaper for a similar stat line. But it's like I said earlier when justifying why the Rockstar had to move down, generally when it comes to troublemakers, cost isn't the concern, the amount of them you need is the concern. And so with the Gambler being one of the more expensive troublemakers, honestly, it's actually kind of one of the better ones. It doesn't have the same problems as the Gangster because it also gives popularity and a decent amount of it too. It still gives a sizable chunk of money at 3 cash. And really the only thing that sucks about the Gambler is the fact that it costs 7 means that you can only get it day 1 if you get a perfect day and get 2 wild buddies and 3 old friends out of the deck. So the chances of you being able to start turn 1 with a Gambler are pretty low. However, beyond that, it's kind of just objectively better than the Gangster, I'm not gonna lie. You'd be surprised how much that difference between 2 to 3 cash matters. Again, it's not as huge as the 1 to 2 cash, but it's a pretty big deal. It gets high B tier. Next up is the Spy. An interesting guest because it's one that I used to think was underwhelming. The Spy is very simple. It only gives 2 cash, and it has the same effect as the Watchdog, where it gets to peek the next guest at the door. Now the problem with the Spy is that it costs 8 popularity to buy, whereas the Watchdog, a literally identical guest that simply gives popularity instead of money, but is otherwise the same, costs half that at only 4. For that reason, initially I thought to myself, isn't the Watchdog just always better than the Spy then? I mean, the cost ratio there is really devastating. And yeah, even still, it's a hard pill for me to swallow that I'm often picking Spies over Watchdogs, even when they're so much more expensive for practically the same thing. But at the end of the day, I mean, I keep emphasizing the importance of consistency, and Spies are like the face of consistency in this game. 2 cash isn't a whole lot, but it's enough to get by on the vast majority of runs if you buy 4 of them. This makes it somewhat comparable to the Auctioneer, literally my pick for best guest in the game, while also having the ability to peek the door, which the Auctioneer doesn't have. And peeking the door, of course, can massively improve your consistency. This was one of the guests that got moved up a little bit. I always wanted to put them in A tier, but I was planning on putting them right next to the Watchdog initially. But I'm actually putting them at a really high A tier spot. And the reason why is because the justification for the Spy not being higher before was, well, the Auctioneer is still better. But I need to remember that the Auctioneer is literally my pick for best guest in the game. So, oh, this guest isn't quite as good as the literal best guest in the game is not really a great justification for why they shouldn't at least be a little bit higher. Next up is the Writer, a very simple but very powerful guest. The Writer costs 8 popularity and gives 1, and their ability is that for every troublemaker in the house, they will give +2 popularity at the end of the day. Which is already a pretty sweet deal, honestly, even if you don't explicitly have a trouble synergy package at the moment. Taking a Writer, most days you're going to end with 2 troublemakers, which means this is a 5 for 8. That's not groundbreaking or anything, but that's already pretty good, honestly. Then what happens when you start introducing the hippies and the cute dogs, and you're able to cram 7 troublemakers into the same house? These things go nuclear. You start maxing out your popularity stat literally every single day when they really get pushed far enough. So if this was a hype tier list, this would easily be going in S tier. But that's just the thing, this tier list isn't based on hype, it isn't based on how good it feels when you get that guest to work, it's based on how often that guest gets you a win. Here's the tough part with Writer. They are ludicrously powerful, they are a good deal, they are good value, but their entire synergy is built on the very thing that will probably kill your run. For that reason, even though they were planned to be a low S tier at the first draft of this list, I eventually almost planned on bonking them down to B tier. But I settled on low A, mostly because I had to keep in mind that, as I said, even if you have no trouble synergy, these guys are typically pretty decent value. Certainly when you're playing the story mode, I highly recommend having some good fun with these, but when it comes to long random streaks where you've got to be as consistent as possible and play it safe, don't get lured into the depths by these things. They're sirens, I tell ya. Telling you to take another troublemaker just so you can get that huge value play. Telling you to run your streak into the rocks. Next up is the Wrestler, and I'm going to be pretty direct here. This is going to seem really, really harsh, but let me explain myself. I'm putting the Wrestler at E tier. It is the top of E tier, but I'm putting him all the way down in E tier, which might seem like a shock. I mean, the Wrestler is essentially just a security guard that has 2 popularity but costs more. I mean, how could that be bad? Security guard's literally an A tier, and it's practically the same guest. And don't get me wrong, it's not really explicitly incorrect to point that out. I use Wrestler from time to time, but at the end of the day, there isn't really, for the most part, many guests on this list at all that are useless. And so just saying I use this guest sometimes, it doesn't really save you from the bottom tiers. Again, the game's pretty well made, there are very few guests that I don't use. So what is with this enormous gap between these two practically identical guests? Well, I haven't revealed just how much more expensive the Wrestler is yet. Where the security guard only costs 4 popularity, the Wrestler costs 9. Now, initially, this might not really seem like a big deal. I mean, wasn't I just saying earlier multiple times how popularity cost usually doesn't have much of an impact? And I mean, if you have these guys around for even just 3 days in the house, they'll pay for themselves, right? Well, maybe, but that's just the problem. The upfront cost is more than double, and it takes time for them to pay you back. Usually, when you need something to boot characters out of the house, you need as much of it as you can, and you need it fast. The fact that the Wrestler has this steeply increased cost for a relatively insignificant upside that is nice but not really important is actually quite a big deal. I'll just put it this way. You can't get everything you want, as you know, in most runs. You have to pick things to cut. And thankfully, because of how cheap the security guard is, you usually don't have to cut many security guards. In fact, I regularly still get to afford 4 security guards in pretty heavy synergy decks without running out of time or popularity. But with the same amount of money that you could buy 4 security guards with, you still can't even buy 2 Wrestlers. That's how bad it is. As a result, if you actually need booting mechanics, but you're given the option to use Wrestler and not security guard, I'm not gonna lie, you can usually only afford 1, maybe 2 Wrestlers. If you try and take any more than 2, you're probably gonna run out of time. And this is all without even mentioning the fact that the main thing that made security guards so good is that you often booted themselves out. So having more popularity on the guard itself doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, this doesn't change the fact that if you need boot mechanics and you haven't been given a Cupid or a security guard, you will use Wrestler. Yes. But my god, will you not be happy about it. You would much rather be using any other booting guest in the game than a Wrestler. And while booting on its own is still so important to the game and so useful that it might not feel too bad using Wrestler, at the end of the day, the fact that it is the worst option out of multiple possible other options, and the fact that even when you do want it, you usually only want 1, maybe 2 of them, I feel like is grounds for E tier, considering even most things in D tier are more useful than that. And last up for the second day's normal guests is the Climber. Here we go. This is our next S tier pick. Second best guest in the game, second only to the Auctioneer. And that might come as a shock to some of you. I mean, don't get me wrong, the climber is generally considered pretty good, but also pretty greedy. And haven't I been making such a big point about how consistency matters here, and how a lot of not super thrilling guests have been pretty high on the list, and a lot of ones that are usually really hype have maybe been just a little bit lower than you would have expected? How would the climber not get kicked down? Well, because I'm going to be quite honest. Climber plus reroll is the single strongest strategy in the entire game, provided you could set it up. And don't get me wrong, sometimes you can't, but 90% of the time, if you're offered the guest to do it, you can set it up pretty safely and with time to spare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What does the climber actually do? They are the single most expensive guest in the game, costing 12 popularity, again, excluding star guests. And they don't give any money or any popularity. Instead, they have a special ability, which is that every single time they enter the house through the door, they get +1 popularity added to their stats permanently. As a side note, it's impossible for any guest in the game to give more than 9 at once, so this does cap out at 9. Either way though, this guest at first might seem interesting but straightforward. They suck at first, they cost a lot up front, but you just keep getting them and eventually they become really good, right? Well, if that was the case, then the climber would honestly probably be like C tier. I mean, you can use the climber like that from time to time. It's not that it's a bad deal in terms of the long-term value, but the main problem with using the climber the seemingly intended way is that it's too expensive to get early, so you have to get it in the mid-game. But in the mid-game, you need to be getting moneymakers, and you need to be expanding your house, and you need to be mitigating trouble, and you probably don't have a whole lot of popularity to spare on getting 4 climbers, especially because, again, these are the most expensive guests in the game. So if you had the time to get climbers, they'd probably be pretty good, but at the end of the day, you just don't. You maybe can get 1, maybe 2, and then those 1, maybe 2 climbers will barely pay for themselves. Well, this is where we finally introduce the Grillmaster back. Because when the Grillmaster makes everyone leave the house, but they also have a chance to re-enter, that includes the climber. And as I mentioned earlier, the number goes up not every day that you get the climber, but rather every single time the climber enters the door. So if you have a climber in your deck and you have 4 Grillmasters, you can get the climber to enter the house 5 times in one day just by re-rolling the house over and over, until eventually, literally within 1 day of buying a climber, it's already giving 5 popularity, with no downside attached. This essentially supercharges your ability to snowball. Again, the main problem with the climber before is that you had to try and get them early to give them time to snowball, but you couldn't really cut into your mid-game to do that without sacrificing other really important things. But with the climber reroll synergy, you genuinely can snowball so fast that you can just bother buying 4 climbers in the endgame and still afford all your star guests. In fact, the vast majority of times, even if you leave your star guests until there are only 4 days left, you can probably afford all 4 of your remaining star guests in the remaining 4 days, and then manage to get all 4 of them in the house on the last day, especially considering you have so many rerolls at your disposal. The long and short of it is this strategy is essentially the most powerful one in the game because, for one, you snowball so hard that you effectively obtain infinite popularity within only 2 to 3 days of having started building the synergy. As well as that, as I mentioned earlier, you have increased consistency because you're taking rerolls to enable the synergy, and so that means you don't have to worry about just getting bad rolls and then ruining your day. Really, the only thing you have to worry about is trouble, but even then, this deck does not require you to take any troublemakers to get maximum value. As a result, if you just get 2 things that deal with trouble and kick out 2 wild buddies from the house, then for the rest of the day you can re-roll and re-roll and re-roll, and you can literally never get caught because there are only 2 troublemakers left and there'd have to be 3 to get arrested. And this is all without even mentioning the fact there are a bunch of guests we haven't even gotten to yet, which have extremely huge synergies with this already existing deck that you don't even need for it to function, but if you have it, it goes even more nuclear. Needless to say, Climber was a very strong contender for literally top pick out of all guests in the game, but the only reason the Auctioneer beats it out is because obviously you still need to take the risk of establishing the synergy with the Climber, and if you don't have any rerolls, the Climber is pretty middling. But absolutely, the Climber is more than deserving of S tier. Moving on to the star guests at the second level, the first one is the Mermaid, which just barely goes above the Alien, but still in C tier. Essentially, the Mermaid costs 5 less popularity to buy than the Alien, and of course is a star guest, so you need her to win. But to cost less, she of course needs to have a downside, and hers is the same as Mr. Popular's, that she forces you to bring another guest. Now, unlike Mr. Popular, this is actually not too bad on a star guest, because you only have to live with it for the last couple turns of the game. Not to mention, at that point, your house is probably going to be pretty big, and you're going to care less about getting less resources, because all you care about is getting star guests. So yeah, the Mermaid is definitely better than the Alien, but only by a small margin for 2 reasons. The first reason being that unfortunately, at a cost of 35, it's just barely too expensive for it to be possible to buy 2 of these in one day, and that's actually a pretty significant downside. That makes it a lot harder to rush these things to end games quickly, which is kind of the whole point of taking star guests that are cheaper for a downside. The other thing that makes the Mermaid unable to crack B tier, in my opinion, is that while their downside very rarely matters because you have to deal with it for such little time and there's so much you can do to avoid it, you gotta remember that when it does matter, it's a much bigger deal than just missing out on a bit of popularity or money. It can really be a run killer. Just to clarify, if your house does become overcrowded, even if your house contains all 4-star guests needed to win the game, you will get arrested before you're allowed to end the day, and you will not win. I've used mermaids a decent amount in my random runs, and I will admit, they've only ever screwed me over 1 time. But that 1 time screwed me over so bad that it killed an entire 12-game long run. The risk of things going wrong with mermaids increases with smaller houses, which you are more likely to get on tougher runs where you get less money. Of course, though, in general, the Mermaid is just so similar to the Alien, ultimately, with how all these benefits and downsides cancel out, that I can't really put them much higher. However, that brings us to the single worst star guest in the game. And honestly, one where I almost leave it up to you how you should interpret this, because I'm technically going to put him at the bottom of E tier, but I want to actually add, there is really a very good argument to put this guy in F tier. It kind of depends on your perspective. The hero's pretty simple. They cost 50 popularity instead of 40, but they give 3 popularity, whereas obviously the Alien, the Mermaid, all these other star guests give none. And that at first glance might seem fine, right? I mean, so long as you get these guys with more than 3 days left, they more than pay for themselves. They're more worth it than the Alien, aren't they? Well, maybe that's true, but you gotta remember that whole upfront cost thing is an issue, and usually the end game here is pretty short when you're playing well. It varies wildly depending on the strategy, but if you average it out, I'd like to guess that I usually start going for star guests with about 7 days left. So unless hero is the first star guest you get, and then you don't get any more heroes, typically the hero is the worst star guest in the game. It very rarely pays for itself. Even if it does increase the upfront cost, which means it takes longer to get the ball rolling, even if it eventually paid off in the end. And really, it should belong in F tier, but there's only 2 reasons I'm not putting it in F tier. For one, I kind of wonder if it makes sense to put a star guest in F tier. At the end of the day, no matter how bad a star guest is, you literally need them to win. You cannot win the game without star guests. And again, I really like the idea of keeping the F tier this sort of you should literally never use this kind of tier, and having the E tier being this is basically F tier, but use it if this happens. You know, Mascot this is basically F tier, but you can use it at the start of the game for a quick popularity boost. Wrestler this is basically F tier, but use it if you have no other booting options and you really need something that can boot something from the house. Similarly, the hero here is kind of like this is basically F tier, but like you might still need it to win simply because it is a star guest. And as well as that, the other reason it might not belong in F tier is because of the fact that it, in fairness, doesn't have a downside. That can kind of be cancelled out by the fact that the Alien also doesn't have a downside, as well as many other star guests. But considering how severe some of the downsides could be for star guests, if you're given the option between one cheaper star guest that has a severe downside and one more expensive star guest that is the hero, you're probably still going to take a couple heroes. So yeah, if you think that logic works out, then that's why they belong in E tier, but I can understand if some of you think maybe that's not justification enough to dodge F tier for this character, and if you do think that, I can fully agree with an argument for putting them in F tier. Moving on to the 3rd level, where the guest count finally starts to shrink a bit, we have the Photographer, another S tier character. In fact, we got quite a lot of really good characters in this day particularly. The Photographer is really simple, but really powerful. They give 1 popularity, but they cost 1 money. And that is pretty hard to swallow, but when you see their effect, you'll understand why. For only 5 popularity, these guys have the ability to once a day take a picture of someone. And when they take a picture of them, you get the score from that guest immediately without ending the day. So let's say you've got a writer in the house with 3 troublemakers. When you end the day, you should get 7 popularity. But let's say you're a little bit worried that you might get caught soon, but you want to keep letting people into the house. Maybe before the day ends, you take a picture of your writer and immediately cash out 7 popularity. And then you get to keep adding people to the house, and even if you get busted, you still got that instant 7 boost. And I should clarify as well, just because you cash out early doesn't mean you also don't get to cash out again when the day ends. That writer would pay twice. So, as you can imagine, the photographer is really versatile and multifaceted in its use cases. Although in fairness, while it is true that it has a lot of uses, 90% of the time, you just find something that pays out big and take a bunch of pictures of it. But even just that is really powerful. And the fact that you don't have to take a picture of any one thing, it can be anything in the house, whatever is best, means even when you don't have great photographer synergy, there's still typically decent stats. Photographers are honestly another guest that there could be a solid argument for saying they're one of the best in the game, but personally the only reason I don't buy it is just because of the fact you have to pay them. And that does suck when money is tight in random scenarios. Not to mention, if money is tight and you have a lot of photographers, which you often will have because they're so good, sometimes in the late game you'll have days where you just get unlucky rolls, and even though you could make enough money to pay all the photographers, you just get an unlucky day, you don't, and you lose all your popularity because you couldn't pay your 4 photographers, and you end up losing an enormous amount of resources as a result. Not a super common disaster, but something that does happen from time to time. Still, overall, the photographer is undeniably an amazing guest, especially because they are extremely powerful with Climber synergy, and Climber's already one of my best picks in the game. And I hope you are ready to get hit with back-to-back S tiers, because the next pick is another one of the best guests in the game, the Cheerleader, my pick for 3rd best guest in the entire game. The Cheerleader's ability is really simple to understand, but really complicated and powerful in its actual use cases. It's simply a 5 popularity cost guest that gives 1 and has 1 simple but insane ability. When you activate their ability, they will recharge the abilities of every other non-cheerleader guest in the entire house. Your photographers get more pictures, your drivers get more tutors, your security guards get to boot more people, you get more rerolls, you get to peek the door more, you get everything. Cheerleaders are enormous value, and value that can be reinterpreted into whatever you need in whatever situation, making them ludicrously versatile. Not to mention that they have lots of synergy with already some of the most powerful effects in the game, like photographers, like the reroll climber strategy, and like tutoring. The only reason that Cheerleader isn't a pick for top guest in the game is, in fairness, you're kind of demanding a pretty high synergy deck to make good use of Cheerleader, and if you get really unlucky, sometimes you get a Cheerleader with a set of guests where you have literally no one to refresh the abilities of. But even in cases where the Cheerleader is underwhelming or you don't really get what you wanted, there's still a 1 for 5. Not a good deal, but not the worst deal in the world, especially because usually you'll at least get 1 ability to recharge with it. And while it might not be super impressive to get a Cheerleader that just lets you get 1 extra tutor, that is kind of like just getting an extra driver for 2 more cost but 1 more popularity stat, which isn't that bad. Next up is the Athlete, a variant of the Grillmaster, and as a result this one should be pretty quick. It's literally the exact same thing as the Grillmaster, it rerolls everyone in the house, only instead of costing 5 and giving 2, it costs 6 and gives 1 and 1. 1 popularity and 1 cash. For that reason, it is slightly better than the Grillmaster, again just because cash gain is so important. And I unfortunately have to tell you that there are so many random streak runs I had to clutch that were really close to losses because the only moneymaker I had was the Athlete. And don't get me wrong, you don't like it when that's the case, but not having the Athlete there would have been a death sentence. But yeah, long story short, does the same thing as the Grillmaster, but very slightly better, so of course it's in S tier with the Grillmaster. Next up is yet another guest that has lots of synergy with cheerleaders and photographers. The Stylist, a guest that costs 7 popularity and at base has in fact negative stats. They give you no popularity and you have to pay them money. However, their ability is pretty powerful. You get to pick 1 guest once a day to give +1 popularity to permanently. So in a way, this is sort of like a climber, but one you have to pay and one that gives the popularity to other guests rather than to themselves. For that reason, I was really torn as to whether this is an S tier guest or not. Eventually I decided it is close. Stylist is my top pick for A tier, but I don't think they quite crack S tier. The main problem here with Stylist is that while it is very powerful, most decks that want to use a Stylist already have other ways of making tons of money and tons of popularity. And so the Stylist isn't bad, but oftentimes it's overkill. And I find it's quite rare you find yourself in a situation where Stylist is the only option for snowballing. When you also factor in the fact that Stylists need payment and don't give any stats on their own, and you also factor in the fact that you almost certainly want photographers with your stylists, which also need payment, unless you've got massive money gain, they are a little bit risky to take. Not to mention, they're especially good with tutors like drivers, but if you start taking things like drivers, well, not only are you going to get even less popularity because they also give 0, but maybe you don't even have the option to take drivers. Maybe you have to take private eyes instead, which then need even more payment. As a result, stylists often become money sinks where you'd much rather just use something like a climber instead. Or sometimes even you don't even need a snowballing mechanic like a climber or a stylist. Sometimes if you just have a bunch of cheerleaders and photographers, you can just take something like a caterer or a comedian and keep taking pictures of them and win the game off of that. All that said, it is still very much true that stylists are extremely powerful snowballing strategies, and when combined with tutors, it becomes an extremely consistent strategy which gives you as a player a lot of control over the outcome of every single day, so you don't have to worry about getting screwed over by RNG. For that reason, I can't put them any lower than the top spot in A tier. Next up is the Counselor, another S tier you might be surprised to hear. In fact, that is our last S tier pick for the list. And that might catch you off guard, because I think most people's opinions on the Counselor, as far as I've seen, are a little bit mixed. On one hand, they are one of the most powerful trouble mitigators in the game, because when you activate their ability, they cancel all trouble on all troublemakers in the entire house. They just simply don't cause trouble anymore for the rest of the day. On one hand, that seems really powerful. I mean, as many troublemakers as you can fit in the house can all be cancelled out at once by one single guest. That's amazing. But then comes other problems. Because the Counselor doesn't just cancel out the trouble like a hippie or a cute dog does, they actually remove it from the guest. That means that guests like the Bartender and the Writer that benefit from trouble synergy actually have anti-synergy with the Counselor. As well as that, while you can get mass cleanses with the Counselor when you get a really good roll, that also requires you to already be running hippies and cute dogs. Without them, you can only fit 2 troublemakers in the house at once to cancel out the trouble on. So that might not seem super worth it, especially because you don't usually want to double dip on both cute dogs, hippies, and counselors. Especially because counselors don't even have any stats. They give nothing and they cost 7. But so far I seem to be arguing why counselors suck. Why are they in S tier? Well, for one very simple reason. You know how I said that counselors can cancel 2 trouble at once rather than 1? And even more, of course, if you have cute dogs and hippies, but usually you don't. Well, remember how many troublemakers you start with in your deck? 4. And remember how many you need for a chance to get busted? 3. 4 take 2 is 2, which is less than 3. So if you literally have 1 counselor in your deck, and you agree to not take any troublemakers in a run, then you just get some drivers to tutor out the counselor, your chances of getting busted for the rest of that run will be practically 0. And you only need to buy 1 counselor. You don't have to waste tons of resources on cramming your deck full of security guards or hippies or cute dogs, which you may or may not draw. No, you can just get 1 counselor, get a bunch of drivers that you'd probably like to have anyway, but also can help tutor out the counselor, and then you never have to worry about trouble for the rest of that entire run. Needless to say, this is a game changer. The amount of runs that would have been brutal otherwise that you can make an absolute breeze by simply removing all threat of troublemakers at the start of every single run, just by taking 1 counselor in your deck. The power of that is amazing. It is actually remarkable how much easier the game gets once you realize that you literally need only 1 counselor to cancel out all threat of losing for the entire run. Of course, the only thing that can still be a problem is that sometimes your only good money-making options are troublemakers. Then you're kind of forced to take more than just the initial 4 troublemakers, and now you need more than 1 counselor. And that can seem like a bad thing, but even then, the counselor's really good, because the number 1 target that you want the counselor to hit usually are moneymakers that cause trouble. Because of course, another benefit of the counselor is that while it clears the trouble, it doesn't actually kick the troublemakers out like a security guard would. So you still get the benefits they provide. So even if you're forced to use something like the gambler as your source of money, you actually want counselors even more then. It is a win-win. if you don't need to use moneymakers that cause trouble, then you literally need one counselor to cheat the game and win forever. And if you do need moneymakers that cause trouble, then you need the counselor anyway to mitigate the risk of that. I was skeptical about the counselor at first, especially because of all the cancelling out of value that you get with it ruining trouble synergy. But I'm not gonna lie, the longer I've played this game, I've only become more and more convinced that the counselor is actually one of the single most powerful guests in the game. Easy S tier. Oh boy, I can't believe I'm doing this. So I've already mentioned that this day is filled with amazing guests, and in the initial version of this list, there was only one exception to that. The celebrity, the next guest on this list. A guest that initially I planned to put in E tier, and I planned to do that for a long time. But when it came time to record my reasoning why, it drove me mad trying to explain what this guest is like. It kept feeling kinda good to use, but I couldn't logic out how it was actually any good. It just seemed so bad on paper. What I ended up with eventually would have been the longest section of the entire video if I hadn't re-recorded it and scrapped it and decided to change my ranking. And even then, at the end of it all, I say, honestly, this is the only one that's still kind of a question mark to me. But I played longer, and I think I'm finally ready to give a take that I feel ridiculous saying, but I also don't think I can disprove. While the celebrity is the weakest new guest on the third day, they are still the best guest in B tier, which feels insane to say for a guest that I was genuinely going to put second to the bottom earlier. But let me explain. I have genuinely become convinced that the celebrity is the single most difficult to use guest in the game, but actually if you know how to use it, it's not bad. I'm not saying it's secretly broken, again it's only B tier, but it is a high B, so it's a decent guest to pick. The actual ability of the celebrity is that they cost 11, they give 2 popularity, they give 3 cash, and they bring 2 friends with them when they enter the house. It's a double Mr. Popular. And considering Mr. Popular is all the way down there in F tier, you might think it's kind of strange that the celebrity could be this high. I mean, I already explained how this mechanic is pretty dangerous to have and can severely cripple your strategy. I also mentioned that this mechanic is kind of confusing because there's no real synergy with it in the entire game, and I also mentioned the fact that it's counterintuitive because getting more copies of them increases the risk of a chain reaction, which just makes things even worse. How could this be an even half-decent guess, especially with more than double the risk of a chain reaction happening with the celebrity? Well, let's take a moment to actually draw the line between Mr. Popular and the celebrity. Why did Mr. Popular suck? Because don't get me wrong, bringing an extra guest didn't really help. But that wasn't the reason why Mr. Popular sucked. The reason why Mr. Popular sucked is even if he didn't have his downside, which sucks already on its own, he himself honestly isn't that great. Remember? He's only a 3 for 5. Not really that crazy. I mean, not bad, but not that crazy, especially considering the downside you have to live with. And so you might look at the celebrity and go, so the difference is, instead of a 5 for 3, it's an 11 for a 2-3. Is that really all too much different? The cost to reward ratio is pretty similar. The stat lines are pretty similar. Is it really that big a deal? Especially for double the risk? Well, yes, it is. Because of the fact that the celebrity makes money and Mr. Popular doesn't. And the celebrity doesn't just make money. They make bank. 3 cash for being in the house. Now, this is another reason why the celebrity was underrated by me at first. I initially thought, okay, don't get me wrong, I like having 3 cash. But how big is that really? I mean, there are other things that make 3 cash. But then I realized, what are the other things that make 3 cash? The gambler's one of them, but the gambler causes trouble, and again, the longer I played, the more I've realized that is kind of a deal breaker. But that only leaves one other option. And this was the big light bulb moment for me that made me realize I should move this, and I should stop doubting myself on this opinion. The main argument I had when I fully thought out the reason why the celebrity has to be bad is that at the end of the day, for all the extra risk you're taking on, the celebrity is just a more expensive auctioneer that gets more popularity with way more risk attached to it. Is that really worth it? And when I put it like that, that might sound pretty convincing. That might sound like, yeah, that's why this character sucks. But then you remember, oh wait, the auctioneer is literally my pick for best guest in the entire game. It's kind of not really a fair comparison point, actually. And so when you take that into consideration and take another look at the list, you realize that actually the celebrity is one of the most enticing moneymakers in the game, and again, that is critically important. Sure, the auctioneer is nicer, but that's because it's the best option in the game. And sure, the spy's a little nicer, but that's also because it's one of the best options in the game. When it comes to what comes next, Well, you don't really have the best options. You have the Gambler, but that's a troublemaker. You have the Gangster, but that's another troublemaker. You have the Ticket Taker, but that's already a pretty underwhelming guest on its own with like no synergies, and it doesn't give that much money while taking away your popularity. And sure, you can say, well, the celebrity has risk attached to it too, just like the Gambler. But when you really put them side by side, what would you rather have? The risk of more guests entering the house, or the risk of having another troublemaker in the deck? Especially considering that when you get busted as a troublemaker, you usually get busted really early in the day because you get an unlucky roll, and you don't get to fill your house like at all. Whereas in the meantime, if you have to end the day early because of guys that add more to the house, that's not as big of a concern because at least you're ending the day with a half full house. The celebrity's downside is actually starting to look a little bit less nasty. Obviously, the main thing that still sucks is that you pay 11 for the celebrity, even though it gives the same rewards as the Gambler, which only costs 7. But in fairness, like I said, popularity cost, not the most relevant, especially because you kind of don't even want that many duplicates of the celebrity anyway. As I mentioned, the more duplicates you get, the more risk you introduce to your deck. And you might think, but you need duplicates, don't you? Because when you get something like the Auctioneer, you get 4 of them every time. If you want a spy, you get 4 of them every time. But here's the important part. You don't usually care about tutoring a spy or tutoring an Auctioneer, but you do care about tutoring a celebrity, because the earlier you get them out the deck, the lower the risk is that they'll blow up your deck later. The fact that you need to get them out of the deck early to mitigate the risk of having them is actually weirdly convenient, because that means you don't need so many copies of them because it makes it worthwhile to tutor them so that you always get them. Essentially what I'm saying is, instead of getting 4 Auctioneers and on average getting 2 or 3 every day, you can just get 2 celebrities and get them every single time by tutoring them every time. And again, don't get me wrong, would you rather have the Auctioneers? Absolutely. But again, Auctioneer's the best guest in the game. Not a fair comparison. Not to mention, like I keep mentioning, you kind of want drivers anyway most of the time. There's a lot of other synergies that can come together here. Like for instance, the Stylist, it turns out, is actually really good with the celebrity, because you practically want to tutor your celebrity every single time. So it's fine to go all in on one 9 popularity celebrity because of the fact you'll get it basically every day because you already want tutors in a celebrity deck anyway. That was the big thing that confused me about the celebrity, is it seemed like this guest had no synergies at all to speak of, and so I really didn't know how you were supposed to use it. For the longest time, I just settled on the idea that you maybe buy one early for an early cash boost, and then just live with the downside of having one in your deck and having to play around it, which was not a terrible idea, but was generally underwhelming and part of the reason I thought it belonged in E tier. But funnily enough, celebrity decks, it turns out, are less so decks about celebrity and its effect, and more so decks that are more built around the structure that you already have to build to make celebrities safe in the first place. Like I said earlier, with this sort of combo of drivers, celebrities, and stylists, they all kind of help each other. You need the driver for the celebrity, but also having the driver makes the stylist pay out more often. You need money for the stylist, which the celebrity provides, and you get it every single time because you always have a driver for it. It all fits together like clockwork. So yeah, long story short, the reason why this is a B tier guest is that while it is certainly a downgrade from Auctioneer, it is unfair to say being a downgrade from Auctioneer is a reason to put you in E tier. Especially when, honestly, I can't justify how this isn't an upgrade to the Gambler. There are so many ways you can just get completely screwed by trouble that yes, you can use skill to lower the chances of, but you still just get screwed sometimes. Whereas when it comes to the downside of bringing more guests, well, that is still a risk, and in the extreme cases, sometimes it's out of your hands. Most of the time, you want tutors in a deck like that anyway, and having a lot of rerolls and tutors and peaks and boots makes it so the risk that these things introduced is far, far more manageable with skillful play than troublemakers are. So I just can't justify putting this any lower than B tier. Honestly, this probably is still the longest segment of the video, but I'm not complaining. This is probably the most interesting segment anyway. Next up is the Bartender. And I'm putting the Bartender sort of mid-A tier. Higher than the Writer, certainly, but not the best in the game. The Bartender in the very first draft of this list was sort of bottom of S tier, and that's mostly because of how nuclear this guy can go. Like, I already talked about the Writer providing huge value, but this guy is a Writer but for money, which is even better. He costs 11 popularity and gives 1, and his ability is for every single troublemaker in the house, you make 2 cash. Just getting 2 Bartenders and a trouble synergy strategy, there you go. You have infinite money. You will max out your money every single day. And I'm not gonna lie, that feels really, really good. And so I do love the Bartender, and my heart wants to put him in S tier. I have to knock him down a tier for the exact same reason as the writer. He is a siren. He is luring you to the rocks. He is telling you, cram your deck full of troublemakers. Just take hippies, you'll be fine. Trust me, you'll make money. You'll make lots of money. And again, in random streaks, you will kill your runs chasing that high. Now that being said, similarly to the writer, the Bartender's still pretty good even if you don't go all in on trouble. Just 2 troublemakers in the house makes it a 1-4 stat line with no strings attached, which is honestly already pretty good. That's a gangster with popularity and no trouble for just a bit more expensive of a cost. That's more than worth it. And I mean, even when you low roll, it's still a 1-2, which is underwhelming for the price you pay, but 1-2, not too bad, especially again, considering it doesn't introduce any risk of its own. If that wasn't true, honestly, I could probably bump him all the way down to B or maybe even C, but because he still does pay out pretty well, even when there's a minimal amount of troublemakers, I think that's good enough reason to say the Bartender is A tier. And funnily enough, it's not just the normal guests in the 3rd level that are strangely good. It's also the star guests, considering that we have a couple of the best star guests in the game, both introduced in the same level. Starting with the Dinosaur. I feel like a lot of people underrate the Dinosaur because it's risky to go for, and it's tied to the other star guest that is introduced in this day, which is generally considered the best star guest in the game. As a result, a lot of people don't pick the Dinosaur in level 3, understandably so, but I actually think the Dinosaur is still a really good star guest, it just kind of gets outshined by the other star guest in this level. The Dinosaur is the cheapest star guest in the game at 25 popularity, but of course, you know it's going to have a pretty sizable downside for that, and it does. It's a troublemaker. And that's quite the problem. Not just because, well, more trouble is scary, but because you need 4-star guests to end the day, but you'll get arrested if you get 3 troublemakers. So without trouble mitigation, it's actually impossible to win off of purely dinosaurs. You need more than just dinosaurs to win. As a result, a lot of people just avoid dinosaurs. They're scared of what they can do to their deck, and don't get me wrong, I can understand that. It is true that taking dinosaurs introduces enormous risk, but it is also ludicrously cheap. You can come back from a game where you literally have 3 days left and no star guests in the house just by taking dinosaurs, to put it in perspective. That's not an unrealistic goal. Of course, you shouldn't do so unless you're prepared with your counselors and your hippies and your cute dogs. And if you don't have that kind of stuff, yes, the dinosaur does start to become less appealing. But even then, I'm talking about going all in on dinosaurs there, which is not necessarily what I'm suggesting. Typically, when I see dinosaurs, I get 2 dinosaurs and 2 of the other thing. This gives you a really good head start on getting your star guests, but still means that you haven't introduced an enormous amount of trouble to the deck. And again, by the end of the game, you've probably got trouble management anyway, most of the time, which makes the dinosaur just even more enticing. Overall, I call it A tier. But what is this mysterious other star guest in this level that apparently blows it out of the water? Well, that would be the Genie. A star guest that I considered very slightly overrated, but I'm also not going to be so contrarian as to pretend it's not the best star guest in the game. It is. It's going in A tier, and a high A tier at that. However, I think most people would place it in S tier, and I think that's just a little bit of a stretch too far. You see, the Genie's effect is very simple, but obviously very powerful on a star guest. He is a driver. He gives you any single guest you want from the entire game. And yes, that does include other Genies. Which means, if you just get 4 Genies, you can get a Genie, you can pull a Genie, you can pull a Genie, you can pull a Genie, and you win immediately off of 1-star guest. Now that's a great deal. How could I not put this guy on S tier? Well, here's the thing. First of all, as you can imagine, this guy's a bit more pricey. In fact, he's a lot more pricey. He's the single most expensive guest in the entire game, full stop. He costs 55 popularity to buy. And that isn't the worst case scenario when you have a snowballing deck, but when you have a deck that's just pure stats, it's actually really sketchy if you're stuck with Genies as your star guests. Because if you're just relying on pure stats, you're probably not going to make it. You might think that 15 extra popularity isn't the end of the world, but when you times that by 4, it becomes 60. Getting 4 Genies will cost you 220 popularity, whereas getting 4 aliens would only have cost you 160. That is a sizable difference. This can be made up for by the fact that usually the very first day that you have all 4 of your star guests, you'll immediately get all 4 in the house. But remember, it's still not a guarantee, even if the chances are really high, and on top of that, I'm not gonna lie, If you're reaching the end of the game and you don't already have tutors of your own, enough that you could probably get all your star guests in 1 to 2 days, I don't know what you're doing most of the time. I mean, there are some situations where maybe you really don't want any tutors, but I'm not gonna lie, by this late in the game, you probably already have drivers, you probably already have spies, you probably don't really need genies. Now again, all that said, genies are absolutely the safest pick for a star guest, presuming you can afford them. And I did mention that while it is true that some strategies work on pure stats and some of them snowball, the vast majority of effective strategies in this game do snowball, which means most of the time you will be able to afford genies, which is why it doesn't drag them down below the dinosaurs. That being said, for all those reasons, I don't think I can put him in S tier. He's going in A tier. Now, unfortunately, level 4 decides to be boring and only introduce 2 new star guests and 0 new normal guests. Either way, though, we have 2 options, a cheaper and a more expensive one. For our cheaper option, we have the Dragon, a star guest which, of course, will get us a win for only 30 popularity, which is a nice and cheap cost. However, we lose 3 money for every single day the dragon occupies the house, and that's on a per dragon basis. Your cash flow is absolutely destroyed the moment you start taking dragons. And again, if you can't pay them, just like with everyone else, it costs your popularity. Popularity that you need at the end of the game to get your other star guests, so that's a pretty severe downside. For those reasons, under normal circumstances, I'd be tempted to put the dragon relatively low down. More like D tier usually. However, there is one thing about the dragon which might seem small, but is pretty huge, honestly. It means I'm actually going to put it right at the bottom of B tier. The fact that it costs 30 popularity means sort of the opposite of the problem the Mermaid had. You can just barely afford 2 dragons in 1 day. And that is a big deal. Again, the main reason I want to say the dragon is worse than the alien is because of the fact that it destroys your money so fast that the second you get 1, you're falling apart really quick. And again, you are already supposed to be ending the game, you know, once you get these things, but even so, you're probably not ending it in 1 turn, and it will only take a couple turns for them to deplete all your funds and then start tearing into your popularity. If these things cost the same amount as mermaids, they would suck. But just that slight reduction of 5 points makes it just so you can cram 2 of them in 1 day. And the fact that you can cram 2 of them in 1 day means you can rush them fast enough that often it doesn't come to that. It doesn't come to all your money being depleted and your popularity getting torn into. As a result, they're actually a pretty good star guest, but you have to know what you're doing with them. In fact, oftentimes I purposely don't buy them when I can afford them so that I can save up the 60 popularity needed to get 2 at once. But then you've also got to, of course, be careful that you're not losing a lot of popularity by holding popularity when you're already at the cap. It's a bit of a tough balancing act, but generally I do think the dragons are above average star guests. And the dragon is accompanied by the Leprechaun, a 50 cost star guest that gives 3 cash instead of taking 3 cash every single day, and that's it. This obviously is reminiscent of the hero, which of course was the same but gave popularity instead of money. And at first it might seem like for that reason the Leprechaun would live with the hero, but honestly, it's not quite as bad as the hero. It goes in D tier, which might come as a shock at first. I mean, D tier is still lower on the list, sure, but is it really all that different giving 3 money over 3 popularity? I mean, sure, we've already made a big point about how important money is early, but wouldn't that work against the Leprechaun here? If money's more important early and popularity's more important late, surely the hero should be better than the Leprechaun if anything. Well, maybe that would be true if it made any sense for the Leprechaun or the hero to be the last star guest you buy, but often when you're given the choice between 2 different star guests, they're the first ones you buy. So in the rare cases you actually want to get them, they are paying for themselves usually, honestly. But in the hero's case, it's not really worth it, even when you get the chance to get one early to make it pay for itself. Meanwhile, getting a Leprechaun early as your first star guest is honestly kind of not a bad idea, especially in random streaks where you don't get a lot of money makers. I mean, it is just an auctioneer, and I mean, top of the list, so like, obviously it's a very, very overpriced auctioneer, but if you need it as a win con anyway later, it's not the worst idea for, as your very first star guest purchase, to get 1 Leprechaun. Now typically you do only get 1, but even still, it is nice to have that long-term cash boost, especially if you're playing a deck that doesn't snowball as much and so you don't get your star guests very fast, so you have to start getting them earlier, which gives the Leprechaun even more turns to pay out. Having something that can give 3 cash is far more coveted than something that can give 3 popularity. Beyond that, awkwardly enough, even though money typically is better in the long term and popularity better in the short term, it actually kind of gets flipped on its head here. The popularity the hero grants because it takes too long to pay off in terms of getting you your next star guest is typically bad in the short term. The only other argument you can make is you could use it to buy other things like drivers or, security guards, but often I just don't find that impact to be all too significant. Meanwhile, making more money gives you more chances to expand your house, and with more house space, you get more chances to get more star guests. So honestly, when it comes to the very end of the game, it goes back to the start, where you'd rather have money than popularity, at least at the very last couple days. So surprisingly, the Leprechaun isn't bad, although yeah, definitely not my preferred choice of star guest. Which finally brings us to the last level where we finally start getting some more new guests. First up is the Werewolf, the epitome of mid. It goes in C tier. The Werewolf is kind of interesting at first. It sort of poses itself as a bit of an upgraded monkey. It gives 4 popularity just like the monkey, and it's a troublemaker, just like the monkey. However, the way it's a troublemaker is a little bit different. It costs 5 popularity instead of 3 because it's only a troublemaker every other day. Half the times it enters the house, it's a werewolf and causes trouble, and half the time, it's a normal man and doesn't cause trouble. It will alternate every single time they enter. This is an interesting, quirky, and flavorful mechanic, but I'm not gonna lie. If you're wondering if you could really manipulate the whole when they go in, when they go out to get the ones you want at the right times and whether that's really a good strategy, I mean, yes, it is possible to do that, but in terms of it actually being a worthwhile strategy, unfortunately the answer is no. Also, important to note, because it took me a while to figure out how this worked, I couldn't tell if the game actually let you know which one it was going to be before it entered the house, and it's a bit unintuitive. Essentially, if you peek the door or look in the Rolodex and you see a werewolf at the door, it's going to be the opposite of whatever you see before you enter the house. So counterintuitively, if you peek the door and see a werewolf at the door, let it in and it will become normal again. Whereas if you see a normal guy who could turn into a werewolf at the door, if you let him in, he will become a werewolf. It's a little bit counterintuitive. I personally would prefer it if it was the opposite, because that tied my brain in knots a bunch and I might have lost a couple runs because I forgot which way round it was. But either way, getting back on topic, the guest itself. Full popularity is a decent amount of popularity. And in fairness, it is nice to have a card that's effectively half a troublemaker. Because sometimes you do kind of want more trouble, but you want to keep things low-key. And I'm not going to lie, this is useful for that. There's just one big deal breaker for me with the werewolf. That being, it has the same kind of problem as the monkey. It's not really a lot of payout for adding another troublemaker to your deck because of the fact it's cheap. But again, you don't care that much about the fact it's cheap, you care more about the fact you're adding a troublemaker to your deck to get this benefit. Maybe if it gave money as well, I understand that wouldn't really make sense from a flavor perspective, but just from a pure balance perspective, even if it just gave 1 cash, it'd probably be a really good guest. But just giving 4 popularity, I can't lie, this guest is kind of meh. Not to mention, it is really hard to actually integrate them into a synergy. I mean, obviously the main one that comes to mind is trouble synergy, but even then, sometimes the fact it sometimes isn't a troublemaker becomes a problem, because you actually need more trouble and you keep getting non-troublemaking werewolves, and then when you don't need trouble, you get all the werewolves in the house and it causes a bunch of trouble and you lose. Yeah, as I say, kind of the epitome of mid. Next up is the Greeter. Okay, so generally, I have praised the design of this game. I have said that just about every guest has its uses. And I'm not about to say that this guest is bad per se, but I have to say this is the only guest that kind of just baffles me. The only guest where I sit there and go, I mean, what did you want us to do with this guy? The Greeter has a simple but potentially powerful effect. He gives 1 popularity, he costs 5, and he has an ability he can use where he will let someone in, and whoever the next person he lets in, he will immediately score them, just like the photographer. The thing is, though, you don't get to know who you're scoring until you've already pressed the button. He could let in an auctioneer and give you 3 cash. Lovely. Or he could let in a stylist and you lose 1 cash and gain nothing. Oh. And there isn't really any way to control who's at the door. The best you can do is you can peek the door to check and see if you're getting what you like, and obviously let them in with the greeter if it's what you like, and if not, you can boot them. But even then, if you boot them, you've increased the chances you'll get what you want by a very small margin, but it's still complete RNG if you're actually going to get what you want afterwards, unless you see them at the door. So while there is the obvious, oh, peek the door and then use the greeter strategy, That's clearly much worse than the photographer, which costs the same amount of popularity for the only other extra downside of needing to be paid. That let you score whatever you want, which would typically provide much more consistent payout and much more huge rewards than the greeter would. Making it just seem like how in the hell would you ever rather have the greeter over the photographer? Even if you made the argument that you don't have to pay the greeter, and that is a significant difference. At the same time, if you need to pay the photographer can take pictures of people that make money to make even more money. You're honestly probably not making any more money by taking a greeter and saving costs, because you're going to lose loads of money game by not taking pictures of people that make good money and instead letting in random guests that might not give all that much. I have really tried with the greeter to figure out a way to make it better than just peeking the door and seeing if you get what you're hoping for. But beyond just thinning the deck as well as peeking, which helps the odds a little but still doesn't really fix this broken guest, this guest's fundamental synergy kind of just does not function. And for that reason, it probably sounds like I'm about to put them real low. Well, I'm going to be a bit more merciful than that. I'm putting them in C still. You see, the main reason they still belong in C is at the end of the day, I'm comparing it to the photographer, which once again, kind of similar to the auctioneer, that is the 5th best guest in the game in my opinion. So if I'm comparing this unfavorably to a guest that's that good, that doesn't speak well of it, but that also isn't reason to put it at the bottom. And it's really a testament to how good the photographer is, that even when the greeter hits random bullshit you don't want, it's kind of not that bad usually. I mean, even if the greeter just hits a wild buddy or something, you'd think that'd suck. But even then, that's a 3 for 5. That's not great. I mean, we've already talked about Mr. Popular. That's not too bad, honestly. And especially considering it's a 3 for 5 that sometimes looks out and becomes like a 10 for 5. Yeah, that's not the worst deal in the world, honestly. I'm more just complain about this guest because it just feels like I have no idea what the developers expected us to do with them. Feels like they're very underbaked. It's more a frustration with the design than with them being weak. They are a little bit weaker than I'd like, but they're certainly usable. Alright, you thought me putting the Genie in A tier rather than S was my hot take. Oh boy, get ready for this one. I'm actually going to cause a riot with this one, maybe. I think the Magician is the 2nd worst non-star guest in the game. I'm putting him in A tier. And that is maybe a shock to some of you, because I hear a lot of people say the Magician's really good. And I understand the logic. The Magician gives 1 popularity, costs 5, and he has the special ability that as long as there is a star guest in your deck, you can pick anyone in the house that you'd like, and you swap them with a star guest, or vice versa. If you already have a star guest in the house and you select them, you can swap them back into the deck and get a normal guest in their place. So the use of this is obvious. The main point of the Magician is to get your star guests faster so that you can end the game faster. But this also of course has the added use case that if there is already a star guest in the house, but you don't have 4 in the deck yet, so you can't win off of it, and you don't want it there, it's just clogging up space, you can obviously use the Magician to swap it out for something that will actually get you some value. That being said, I know this might sound a bit, I don't know, obstinate to say, but like, really think about it. Don't just think I'm being dumb and awkward. Genuine question, how the fuck is this any better than the Driver? The Driver, 1, costs significantly less, 2, can give you anything you want from your deck, not just the star guests, and 3, does not require a star guest to be in the deck to function. That means he's useful at all points in the game, rather than only at the end game. That means he's useful within multiple different synergies, and he's also less of a burden on your deck to obtain. Now don't get me wrong, there are some answers you could give to that question. Probably the biggest one that I think is the most relevant, even though it might sound quite small, is the fact that the Magician doesn't pull a star guest from your deck, it swaps out positions. As in, to get a star guest from your deck with the Driver would take 2 slots, 1 for the Driver and 1 for the star guest. Whereas the Magician only takes up 1 slot because it uses an already existing slot to put the star into. That does mean that you fill up the house slower, giving you more time to get your star guests. That being said, when we're talking about tutors, you usually get your star guests so fast, you don't really need to worry about that anyway. So the very last thing I could come up with to make any argument for the Magician, and I really tried to make this work, was that you could also use the Magician as trouble management. Because of the fact that you're actually removing something from the house to get the star guests in, if you have troublemakers that are making it difficult to find your star guests, you can kick them out using the magician while also pulling more star guests. Especially if those star guests actually have positive effects attached to them, that could be really powerful. Like if I were to construct a best case scenario for the magician, I think it'd be great if you could get a magician in the mid game alongside one leprechaun, and you constantly swap out your troublemakers for leprechauns that make you money instead of causing trouble. That'd be really nice. But already leprechauns aren't the ideal star guest, and neither are heroes. Generally, all of the more expensive star guests that have upsides as a result, for the most part, not really worth it, except the Genie, but even then the Genie's mostly worth it for the ability to get other Genies, which is only relevant on the last day. If you already have Genies, you don't really need magicians. So for the most part, the magician actually kinda sucks. I'll just put it this way. Yeah, it helps you find your star guests, so do 50 other guests in the game. And don't get me wrong, the magician does it better than anyone else, but it's literally the only thing he does. He has no synergies, there's no way you can make him work that is at least anywhere near feasible. You just get him to get star guests faster. And while that's fine to do, I'm not saying don't start buying magicians if you already have 4-star guests and you need to get them as fast as possible. At the same time, really consider this. Isn't the magician just a dead guest slot in the shop in a random scenario when you get it? Especially if you already have drivers and private eyes. There are so many deck management mechanics in this game that you really don't need a magician to find good star guests as fast as possible. Again, the only thing that saves the magician from being an F-tier guest is the fact that, as I said, if you have the option, you still would buy magicians to find star guests faster. Again, it's just, most of the time you don't need to, and you shouldn't. And the very final standard guest in the game is Cupid. An interesting one to say the least. We got a little sneak peek of this guy earlier. He costs 8 rather than 4 popularity, like the security guard, and he gives 1 popularity himself. And instead of kicking out 1 person, he can kick out 2. The 2 people he kicks out have to be next to each other in the house, so you don't have quite as much free choice with Cupid. You also don't have the option to not kick 2 people out. If you pick 1, you have to pick another one. So at first it might seem like Cupid could suffer the same fate as the wrestler. It's a lot more expensive than the initial security guard. You kind of have less choice even though you're kicking more people out, and it's trying to give popularity to compensate for its downsides. But believe it or not, I actually think Cupid is significantly better than the wrestler. So much so, I think it just barely cracks A tier. Now what's going on there? You'd think following the same logic that maybe put the wrestler in E tier would put Cupid at best in the middle. But I actually think that Cupid is really good, but in a way that's quite complicated and difficult to take advantage of. But if you know how to do it, what Cupid provides is something that no other guest in the entire game can do. You know how earlier, when I was justifying why the security guard is really good, I was saying that it's a net 0 card in your deck. And that means you're not actually clogging your deck by taking it. Well, here's the interesting part about Cupid. You can apply the same logic to Cupid, but take it even further. Cupid isn't just a net 0 card in your deck. Cupid is a net -1 card in your deck. It is a card you add to your deck that effectively makes your deck smaller, because it's 1 card that gets rid of 2. And you know how I said earlier there is no way to remove anything from your deck permanently? Not a single thing in the game that can do that. Well, that means that Cupid is the only guest in the entire game capable of actually shrinking your deck. Again, you can't get rid of any one guest permanently, unfortunately, but if your deck is getting too big and you need to increase your odds of finding certain guests that are absolutely critical to your strategy working, then Cupids are a good option. They're not only trouble management, but they're also deck thinning. The only deck thinning option you have in the game. Cupid is how I made the Mascot strategy work. Without Cupid, the amount of things I would need to keep this strategy ticking over would bloat the deck, and I wouldn't be able to find enough old friends and mascots to make the deck survive. But with 4 Cupids thinning the deck out like crazy while also managing as much trouble as possible, this deck actually went really well. Again, I'm not saying that the mascots are actually secretly good, I'm just saying it shows how good Cupid is, that they can turn something as bad as mascots into a powerful strategy when you get the right amount of them at the right times. Really, if anything, I would have put Cupid above the security guard if it weren't for the downside that the 2 people you have to boot unfortunately do need to be next to each other, which does mean you're often booting people you didn't really want to get rid of just because you need to kick 2. Though really, I say that, it's not a big deal. Most of the time it's that you want to boot 2 troublemakers, but instead you have to boot a troublemaker and an old friend. And it's like, okay, well, I didn't really need to boot that old friend. I would have rather got another troublemaker, but it also was just a 1 in my house that wasn't doing a whole lot. So I mean, it's not really that bad if I kick it out. I'll probably get something better. Which brings us to the final 2 star guests in the game. First up, the Unicorn. Not one that I have particularly strong opinions on, I'm afraid. It costs 45 instead of 40 to buy, but it cancels out 1 trouble. For that reason, I think it's fine. Yeah, I don't have the strongest opinions on the Unicorn. I mean, trouble cancellation is nice. Is that helpful on a star guest? Kind of. I mean, sometimes you can't get your other star guests because you get too many troublemakers early, but by the same token, you also aren't going to have these guys in your deck for too long before the game ends. So you don't get a whole lot of value for paying extra, but then it's only 5 extra. So I'm not going to lie, this is just one of the few situations where, as much as I usually like to go super in depth, I don't think there is a whole lot of depth here. I think that, honestly, the Unicorn is just sort of fine. It has a lot of very small upsides, but also a lot of very small downsides, and I kind of feel like they all just cancel out. If I had to call it, I think I'd say that the Unicorn's a little bit better than the Alien, but by a really tiny margin. It goes in C tier. And for the final entry on the list, we have the Ghost. Another star guest that costs 45. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'm completely baffled as to why they put the Ghost and the Unicorn in the same story level, because I'm not gonna lie, they do practically the same thing. In fact, there's basically no reason to use the Unicorn if you're offered the Ghost, because the Ghost is just the Unicorn but better, frankly. The Ghost is a star guest, which does give 0 points, but their special ability is that they're a security guard. They can boot someone. And yes, just like with a security guard, they can boot themselves if you don't have 4-star guests yet and you don't want them clogging up space. Literally, the only reason the Unicorn could even theoretically be better is, of course, the fact you don't have to boot trouble to get rid of it. You can just cancel it out and keep the rewards from keeping troublemakers in the house. But again, because we're talking the end game here, you probably don't care. You probably would care a whole lot more about being able to boot out these star guests when you don't have 4 of them yet, so they aren't clogging up house space, which is what taking the Ghost allows you to do. And again, for the exact same price as the Unicorn. The simple versatility and reliableness of the Ghost makes it an easy pick for A tier as one of the game's best star guests. And that will round out the list ordered within tiers. That is every single guest in Party House ranked. Sorry if this one ended up a bit long, but I really wanted to finish this in one last big sprint. If you haven't already, I do highly recommend you check out UFO 50. And with all that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.